Crystal McDowell, a heartbreaking tale. On Friday, August 25th, a devoted mother of two disappeared from her home in Texas. Her loved ones were deeply concerned for her well-being and immediately began searching for her. However, their efforts were complicated by the fact that Hurricane Harvey was set to hit the area around the same time, and they were working against the clock. What happened to Crystal McDowell? Was she a victim of the strong forces of the hurricane, or did someone take her? Crystal was a fearless woman with a great sense of humor. She loved goofing around and was not afraid of a challenge. Her friends and family described her as loving, warm, and adventurous. She loved her two kids, and she was truly happy with her life. In 2017, she divorced her husband Steve after 10 years of marriage. She was tired of being the provider in the family and wanted new challenges and adventures in life. She continued to live with Steve when her new house was renovated, and as she had also helped him with payments for the house, this was quite a reasonable arrangement. Later that year, she met Paul, and they immediately hit it off. They were both divorced and both wanted to travel and see the world. They planned a trip to Europe, and she even got a ticket for Belgium. Unfortunately, she never had a chance to go. On the Friday of her disappearance, she was last seen leaving her boyfriend Paul's house at approximately 7:10 a.m. Later that day, when he lost contact with her, he tried calling friends and family to see if anyone had heard from her. When he called her Uncle Jeff, the alarm bells went off. As Jeff hadn't heard anything from his niece that day, he knew something was wrong, as the two of them were very close. When Crystal was 11, she lost her parents, and her Uncle Jeff raised her from that point on. Now he had to make a difficult phone call to the police because his niece had gone missing. As the storm approached, many people in the area were focused on preparing their homes and families for its arrival. The hurricane brought with it heavy rains, strong winds, and widespread flooding, making it difficult for search parties to navigate the area. The local authorities were also stretched thin as they worked to keep people safe during the storm. Despite the challenging conditions, Crystal's loved ones continued to search for her tirelessly. Unfortunately, as the storm continued to rage, the search for Crystal became increasingly difficult. The rising floodwaters made it dangerous to travel through the area, and many roads were closed due to flooding and debris. Investigators were focusing on the men in Crystal's life, and they had different theories on who the perpetrator was. They interviewed her Uncle Jeff, her new boyfriend Paul, and her ex-husband Steve. After a polygraph, they cleared her Uncle Jeff as a suspect. Both Steve and Paul failed the polygraph, and they became the main suspects in the case. In the days that followed, the search for Crystal continued, with volunteers and law enforcement agencies working together to comb through the affected areas. Then suddenly, Crystal's family spotted her missing black Mercedes near a motel. It was surrounded by water, and when police finally got access to the car, they immediately saw that it had been tampered with. The car was unlocked, and the keys were still in the ignition, telling police that someone parked the car in the hope of someone stealing it. Lucky for the investigators, due to the flood, nobody got the chance to do so. Now police had a location to look into. They got the surveillance footage from the nearby gas station and found something interesting. A male figure, looking a lot like Steve, was seen emptying his trunk and throwing something in the trash can at the station. He pushed his hand so far down that it was obvious he had something to hide. Police also noticed that Steve looked across the road towards the motel, where police found the missing car. They found this very suspicious, and they got a hold of the surveillance from the motel as well. They could see a man, resembling Steve, getting out of the parked car. Police believe Steve then bought a bicycle to get home. He was caught on a Walmart security camera paying for the bike, and on another camera cycling home. But the videos were grainy and purely superficial evidence. Still, the police were convinced that Steve was the killer, and he became the main person of interest. But knowing who the killer is and proving it are two totally different things. They went to the gas station to retrieve whatever Steve had thrown in the trash, but unfortunately for the police, due to the flood, everything had floated out and was now gone. A close friend of Crystal told police that she first filed for divorce in 2008, just 1 year after they got married. But because Steve made threats to kill himself, she didn't go through with it. As the police looked closer into Steve and Crystal's past, they found a huge red flag. After Crystal filed for divorce in 2017, she made a 911 call because Steve had disappeared with their kids. He was supposed to have the kids that day, but didn't return home as agreed. He also implied that he would harm himself, Crystal, and the kids. Fortunately, Steve returned the kids unharmed a few days later, and no charges were filed against him. Knowing this, the police were now afraid that Steve would hurt the children, so they got a warrant to have the children removed from his custody. Now that the police had nothing to lose, they could push Steve to confess. He told the police that he needed to go home, and he would tell them everything the next day. Because the kids were safe in the house of Crystal's aunt, the police agreed to let him go. The next day, on September 9, Steve confessed to Crystal's murder. Steve said they got into an argument on the morning she got home from her boyfriend's house. He was mad at her for staying out all night. She told him that she didn't love him anymore and that their marriage was over. In that moment, Steve snapped and got her into a chokehold where he strangled Crystal to death. While his kids were still asleep upstairs, Steve put Crystal's dead body into trash bags and hid her in the trunk of his car. He waited until early the next morning to drive to a secure location to hide the body, leaving his 2 young children home alone. He led investigators to the location, and they found Crystal's body in the woods. Steve's confession was the final piece of the puzzle, and the police could now arrest him and take him to trial. The jury spent only 3.5 hours deliberating, and Steve was sentenced to 50 years in prison. But the tragedy doesn't end there. Crystal's 2 children have to grow up without either of their parents. This is a really heartbreaking story that left a scar in many people's lives.